Allison. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing great. So to start with something like this where language is so I like that all these characters are yappers. And so language plays a really big part of like understanding how they all differ from each other. How does something like a very, kind of linguistically heavy script inform you about like a character and how they're going to interact with this world that they're in?
I think, one of the most important things about Charlotte, and it's said very early on, is, Werther says she reads. Who reads?
Charlotte.
And and as someone who is an obsessive reader, I that was deeply appealing, and I think there is uh, a a really deep level of literary love. So Jose, who wrote the script, we've been friends for 20 years,
Mm.
and he is someone who is a very great book club companion and the type of person who would read, The Sorrows of Young Werther and say, why don't I adapt this as a modern day rom-com? But his love of dialogue, his love of words, kind of runs through the entirety of the script and was part of the reason that I felt so comfortable with Charlotte, because she is someone who is so adept with language. And I love when characters speak the way I wish I did on my best day.
Hmm.
And there's so often the people, the whole movements of cinema based around the idea of this kind of mumbling language. And I think the aspirational kind of feeling of, I wish we could form full sentences all the time and have the thing we want to say on the tip of our tongue is deeply appealing. And the different ways that everybody's anxiety kind of plays out in their language, which I think is another. Jose and I are both heavily anxious people, so I think that's also a easier to talk it through with words than necessarily to completely allow yourself to be overly emotional. And I think Werther walks this line between this highly literary language as well as a deep emotional life and sort of impulse driven thing that to someone as cerebral as Charlotte is deeply appealing.
Yeah, and I think, Jose and I talked about the minute you put Douglas Booth in something where he's an intelligent young man, I instantly thought of like Riot Club. And he was like, that's what I did. And so I do like that, like his love of, literature and cinema and stuff does come across in this, like not only from the casting, but in the screenplay itself. For you when you're doing a project like this, and it is, not only kind of harkening back to movies we used to make in like the 90s and early 2000s that we don't necessarily make anymore, but also one that is like adapting a weird novel that not that many people probably like knew about prior. What kind of prep work goes into something like that? Like, is it reading the book? Is it just the script? Or what do you kind of do to really nail down the tone of something like this?
I did not read the book because I knew there were that it was an adaptation, and also that whatever it ended up being was going to tonally be what Jose imagined it to be. And my main concern, I love rehearsal. I have a background in the theater. My favorite thing is table work, where you pick apart every single line and look at the number of syllables or where a consonant might be, like really detailed, granular kind of staring at words sort of stuff. And so when Doug was still in London and Jose was in Toronto and I was, we would get together on Zoom and read some of those scenes to be sure that we had the script in hand, and to be really sure. Doug and I would just meet up and go over words, throughout the first weeks we were in Toronto for prep, just to sit with what felt like the most important part to me of the story, which is how to make those words feel utterly natural despite their heightened sensibility. And
Mhm.
I think that matching that across the board tonally, just in terms of visuals, in terms of costumes, of just everything dialed up just a slight notch to give it this lift of what it feels like to fall in love when colors are brighter and the world is more spectacular and all of these chemicals are flooding your brain to make you feel invincible. And and all of that kind of gathering together into this make it sound off the cuff because you know it so incredibly well.
Mhm.
Uh, so it was just a lot of time with the script itself and sitting and talking about it. And I was obsessing about the ages of my siblings and some of the adaptation of, this 18th century thing, sort of saying, well, how old is she? How old are her siblings? When did she graduate high school? Why didn't she go to college? Just all of these. Yeah, which when you're nobility in, 250 years ago in Germany, it's slightly easier to
To
kind of.
justify.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
When I like every time I hear an actor's like, oh, I did theater, I my like approach to acting is based in theater. I get excited because I have a degree in it, so I like talking about stuff like that. How
Yeah.
has your history with theater kind of helped you? Because like I'm a nerd, so I watched you in Picard, and it's like you worked with someone who that is kind of his entire deal is Patrick Stewart is like a big theater person that we all know he's bringing theatrics to something. But how does it help you when you do these new characters kind of like go back to your theater roots?
I think uh you know it it mostly relates to the relationship to the text.
Hmm.
That's the biggest thing, is the importance of the words on the page. And I speak to actors who work in a very different way, um, in terms of needing to kind of morph the language around their own selves and kind of futz with it.
Mm-hmm.
And my goal is always to question and look at the details of why certain words are used. And when I'm speaking about consonants and syllables, it gets that way. And I always love when I can work with a writer who sees it in the same way, of how these tenses shift the feeling of something,
Mm-hmm.
or how the use of names, full name, just all of these tiny details and the way we use language is kind of the basis for um, differentiating character, for giving the history, and for me, for just a way into, well, a person who talks like this is this. So it's always the base for me. And I speak to many of my favorite actors who are like, I can't I can't improvise for the life of me. I'm one of them. I'm like, don't ask me to say something that's not on the page. It will freak me out and I will sound, I don't know how to do it, because
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's all so based in the words and the construct of the thing. So I love getting the chance to have the influence of all these things and the musicality of a language that somebody, I mean, Jose spent years working on this script. So by the time we got to actually shoot it, it had been stuff that he had been thinking about for, like a decade.
Yeah. That's always so fascinating to me because I was like, I'm also an improviser. So I'm always like, oh, it figures that in my brain works. But that's why I love
Yeah.
theater because everyone is also different in how they like approach things. I think it's such a cool
One
art.
of my favorite UCB shows to do, which is a living nightmare, is called Gravid
Uh-huh.
Water.
I knew
So
exactly
I
what you were
learned
gonna
my
say.
side of the dialogue and then go on stage with an improviser who has no idea. Yes. And it is a true nightmare, but also gloriously like rids oneself of all of the anxiety of literally every stress nightmare I ever have is theater based.
That is one of my favorite shows. I once watched Scott Adsit think he was in love with someone and realize it was his daughter, and like halfway through quickly pivot, and it was the funniest thing I've ever seen. So I watched him be like,
Yeah.
"Oh,"
Yeah.
in real life.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's
But
marvelous.
thank you for talking with me today. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait for everyone to get to see Young Werther.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a
Okay.
great
Bye.
one. Bye.